folks just believe in the things they've heard and the things they read. Nobody knows what awaits for the dead. I'm glad I can't go back to where I came from. I'm glad those days are gone for good. But if I could take spirits from my past and bring them here, you know I would. You know I would. Nobody speaks to God these days. Nobody speaks to God these days. I'd like to think He's looking down and laughing at our wounds. Nobody speaks to God these days. When I was a child, I tried to fool me. Said the road the man was lost and that it was real. But I've seen everywhere. This soul's one big old Catherine wheel, spinning still. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. It takes a lot to change your plans, have a drink to change your mind. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time to let the old ways die.
We are in our series, What Next? Discussion about heaven, hell, and the afterlife. And I'll say this, I think this is going to be a fascinating and interesting conversation. But also we're not going to handle this in the traditional way that maybe you've been to churches and you've heard them talk about things like heaven and hell and the afterlife. And if you've been with us for any time, you understand what that looks like and you get that. But maybe if you're new here and you're just thinking, oh no, what did I walk into? They're talking about hell. And just so you know, it's not going to be the traditional discussion that maybe you're used to. And I was able to get it up, so thank you. Do it here. Awesome. But here at Downtown Faith, as we create space to discuss life and faith, I feel like we have to have this conversation, right? If we're going to talk about things that are meaningful, we have to get into some of this mystery around the afterlife. I love the way that Rob Bell says it in his book, Love Wins. He says this way, the kind of faith that Jesus invites us into doesn't skirt the big questions about topics like God and Jesus and salvation and judgment and heaven and hell, but takes us deep into the heart of them. And so that's what I want to do. I want to go deep into the heart of these discussions. Now, for some, this may bring on some real anxiety. I can understand that. I've been preparing for this for a while, right? Like maybe you struggle with anxiety of death, and this is something that really gets you, and you're not sure how to be able to handle it. I just want you to know this is a safe place. You can come here, you can actually unburden that, share those anxieties. But I think it's important that we have this talk, this discussion, that we dive into the nuances of it. So, talking about heaven, hell, and the afterlife, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to just look at the afterlife in general. I think we need to explore this idea of life after death. Right? We understand life and death. This is almost the thing, what is it? Death and taxes are the things that are most certainly going to happen. But the rest of it is this mystery. Afterlife is this thing that is based on faith. And when you look at the prominent views, each of these is based on, I don't know, but this is what I think. So some prominent views of the afterlife. First off, dead over. Dead over, right? Whatever you were before you were born, whatever that was, that's what you go back to. And so a lot of people, as we see in America, are pulling away from religion and religious expressions, religious ideas. They look to science, and there's very little science to suggest an afterlife. And so we just think dead over. We don't have evidence for anything else. So as far as we can tell, the thing that is next is we're dead over. Consciousness evaporates. We're done. And a lot of people call this like a materialistic, humanistic point of view. Okay? And it's a very God. I'll tell you this, I know people who live their life to the fullest and the best, most positive way here on earth because they believe that when they're done, there is nothing else. Okay? And they're good people that certainly believe that. And there's reincarnation, which is this idea that my consciousness will be absorbed into the universe and then I will come back as something else in a new body. This reincarnation, or incarnation is just the idea of our spirit in a body, and this reincarnation is that this is just constantly happening. And based on some of the religious views on this, would be based on my behavior, based on my life and how I live this life now, that will determine what kind of situation I am brought back to in the future as I reincarnate. And so that there's some religious views around reincarnation as well. And then there's the heaven or hell. And this takes on a lot of different shapes and sizes, right? There's a lot of different backgrounds and conversations religiously around heaven and hell. There's various things that different groups believe, whether it's things like Islam, the 72 virgins, Mormon afterlife will often take us to inhabiting a planet of some sort, and the various religions have various ideas of some kind of heaven and hell. Even in Greek mythology, there was this idea of this Mount Olympus, and then there was Hades, and then you could get divided off into this other place that was hell-like within that system. And so most religious systems have some kind of idea of heaven or hell, and how you get there is a lot of times the difference in those religions. And each of these beliefs are based on uncertainty, which is faith is the flip side of the coin of uncertainty. We need to have this conversation well. We have to embrace the uncertainty. We have to jump right in knowing that this ultimately is mystery. So we're talking about life and faith, but we also talk about, today we're going to talk about afterlife and faith. And so if we're going to talk about afterlife and faith, let's look at life real quick. I want you to track with me here in a couple things. First off, Earth is the only planet currently that we know of that we can tell that can sustain life. Right? And according to astrophysicist Eric Zackerson, he did the math that Earth seems to be a 1 in 700 quintillion kind of place. Right? So this vast, ever-expanding universe, life seems to only be happening in one place, here on Earth. So it's just the odds of life, right, are pretty small in this vast, expansive universe. Now look at that. How about individually? Let's just talk individually. What are the odds of you, right? Of you and life. I love this. This is wonderful. So let's start small. The probability of your dad meeting your mom, 1 in 20,000. Okay? The odds that they stay together long enough, like no death, no divorce, to have kids is 1 in 2,000. So right now you're at 1 in 40 million, and we've just started the odds that you exist. As we keep going, we look at the odds of the egg and the sperm that made you and not somebody else get together, and that's 1 in 400 quadrillion, and you keep going down, and what are the odds that your lineage remain unbroken for the length of human experience? It gets down into these numbers that I don't even know what the name of them is. And then if you keep going, you keep asking the question, what you get to is the odds that you exist at all, basically 0. So this is what I want us to think about. Life itself is statistically improbable, largely absurd, and an experienced reality. Improbable, absurd, and yet it's experienced every day, right? So if we think about that, like if life itself is absurd and is odd, but it is an experience, then that leads us to think of the afterlife maybe a little differently. And this is another kind of experience that has been kind of on the radar, near-death experiences. How many have ever heard this term, near-death experience? Yeah. So it's coined in 1975 by a doctor whose name I have down here, if this will show me. And I got it? Okay. No problem. Sorry, I don't remember his name. Moody is his last name, but in 1975, he coined the term. Can you go back a few slides, please? There you go, right there. He coined the term near-death experience, and when this happened, it was anecdotal evidence. Is all he had. He had stories of people he had resuscitated, and what he hypothesized was the rise of resuscitation techniques and technology had led people to die and come back and be able to share these stories like never before in history, right? We had this opportunity to hear from people who caught a glimpse of this other thing because of our resuscitation techniques and technology. And actually, statistics will say that it's about 4%, 1 in 25 Americans, it's about 13 million Americans, have actually had some kind of experience like this. And in 1975, it was anecdotal evidence, but some doctors decided who didn't believe in afterlife. These weren't people who were trying to find an excuse for God or a path to God. Said, listen, these stories are fascinating, but there's no science here. And so they decided, as medical doctors, to try and compile the science. And one of the doctors that really did this was Jeffrey Long, Dr. Jeffrey Long. And his experience was this. He heard about the book, and then he heard a story from a friend. And they share the story in the book Imagining Heaven by a pastor, John Burke. And it's a really interesting book where he takes these near-death experience stories, he compiles, he finds similarities, and it's a wonderful, wonderful resource if you're further interested in this. But he shares about Dr. Long's friend, Sheila, and they're at dinner, and she talks about being resuscitated. And since he had heard this story, he asked her, what happened? She was like, oh, well, I don't normally tell people this because they think I'm crazy. I just sound crazy when I tell people this. And then she goes into this story. And I was going to read it word for word, but I'll tell it to you because since I don't have it in front of me. Is that she was out of her body, and she saw the EKG machine. She saw that she had flatlined, and she sees the panic, and she feels like she's looking over her body from the ceiling in this room, and she sees the panic and the doctors, and they're working on her, and then her body is taken out of that room into the room that she was in before, and she sees nurses that she recognizes, and then she is taken to this tunnel, and she's drawn to this tunnel with this light at the end, and again, you're thinking, oh, these are familiar things about this, and she gets to this place, and she says that she's surrounded by people that she knows that had passed before, people that she was familiar with. She could recognize them, she could talk to them, and that there was this mystical being of, as she described, love and compassion. It spoke with her and talked with her and said, do you want to go back? She's, I'm not sure. She said that was pretty much her being indecisive at that age. And this was her experience, and then she was resuscitated. And these are story after story after story. Now, they're not all beautiful. They're not all beautiful. There are various experiences. Some that are hellish and some that are heavenish, if you will. But I think it's really important that we look at even just the scientific, the rational evidence of this. And doctors over the last 40 years have been compiling these stories and finding the research and the probability. And here's what Dr. Long comes out to in this quote here. Go to the next one. NDEs, near-death experiences, provide such powerful scientific evidence that it is reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife. It is reasonable to accept the existence of an scientifically, rationally, which leads us to think this right here, and I want to build on this. The potential of an afterlife is as absurd and as reasonable as the reality of this life. Remember, the idea that you even exist is the odds are basically zero. And that's absurd. And yet you're experiencing your life right now. And so the idea that it's reasonable and it's absurd to think of and consider an afterlife as well. Because some people want to put that, oh, that's just the religious, oh, that's just this thing that makes you an excuse not to live good now, right? There's this thing and this other. And we're going to talk about all these things, but first and foremost today, I want us to understand that it is reasonable and absurd to believe in this life and in an afterlife. So, our idea worth discussing right here. If an afterlife is reasonable, it's reasonable to hope in an afterlife. If an afterlife is reasonable, it is reasonable to hope in an afterlife. It's not some crazy thing to have faith and hope in this mystery of that there is something else and something more. And for us here at Downtown Faith, sometimes people ask what kind of church we are. We follow Jesus and we try and help other people do the same. And so I want to look at what Jesus said today. He talks about this frequently with people as there's all kinds of questions. And there was, among the religious elites in the Jewish community, there was this discussion of afterlife, or what was often called the resurrected life. Was there resurrection? Was there life after life? And Jesus is talking about the authority of life and death that God has and that he has via God. And he says this right here, which I think is interesting for us. Don't be so surprised. Indeed, the time is coming when all the dead in their graves will hear the voice of God's Son, and they will rise again. Those who have done good will rise to experience eternal life, and those who have continued in evil will rise to experience judgment. This reignition of consciousness, this even bodily resurrection, and then there is an experience. Now, there's a lot of debate on, right? Like those who have done good, what does that mean, right? And those who have continued in evil, who is that? What does that mean? And what does that mean? Right? There's a lot of discussion. So in the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about hell, we're going to talk about heaven, and we're going to give the broad stroke views of heaven and hell because they're not everything that you think they are. A lot of our views of heaven and hell come from modern literature and ideas that are not necessarily what we find in the Bible and in Jesus' teachings. And so it's going to be really, really great to dive into these views of heaven and hell over the next few weeks. But we see that there is this possible good experience, right? And this of life and this experience of judgment Jesus teaches about. So we're going to jump into those. But the next few weeks, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Rome, and he talks about this expectant. If I get the next slide, please. He talks about this expectancy here. He says, for all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. This idea of there is this future day, and it's not just humanity that is waiting, but that all creation is hoping and expecting this time where God is going to make things right. What we know is the kingdom of God that is already and not yet. That there is this hope, and there is this expectancy. Why? Because, go to the next slide. If an afterlife is reasonable, it's reasonable to hope in an afterlife. You see, sometimes a discussion about heaven and hell and the afterlife can be really heavy, and it can be dark, and it can be even damning from certain people to certain people, and that is not how I want to approach this discussion. For us, as we talk about this, I want us to approach it with hope. With hope. As we look into heaven and hell, and we explore what are these things, and what can the Bible teach us, and what can we learn from Jesus, and what can we learn from each other? Like, what should we all land on? Well, hopefully, it's hope. It's important. It's what will carry us through. And we hope because we realize that it is a mystery. The writers of the Bible don't gloss over this. They refer to the afterlife and after death, what happens, as a mystery. We have hints. We have some scientific evidence. Like I said, you can read. There's work after work after work on these near-death experiences and what they're teaching biologists and people about consciousness and about the human body and about life and about death. It's out there. The scientific world is working feverishly to stop death, right? Like that's most of what the medical doctors are working on. So there's the science out there. There's also the life-giving hope in Jesus. And so as we turn to each other and we talk about this today, I hope that it is a wonderful discussion. I hope that it is profitable, but I also pray that it is a hopeful